$166 billion. That's how much the United States government has to pay back. Money it already collected, already spent, and now has to return because two separate federal courts ruled the tariffs behind it were illegal. This week, the number became public, and instead of stopping, the administration announced new tariffs on 60 more countries the very next day. Three numbers explain how a government loses a fortune and doubles its bet in the same week. The first one is the number nobody in Washington wants repeated out loud. Start with where the money came from. Between June of last year and February of this year, the federal government collected tariff revenue of roughly $27 to $31 billion a month, adding up to close to $195 billion for the fiscal year. That was the number the administration pointed to as proof the tariffs were working. Officials cited it in press conferences. It appeared in budget projections. It became for a while the single strongest argument for continuing the policy, no matter who complained about the price increases at the register. Then on February 20th, the Supreme Court struck down the sweeping tariffs imposed under the Emergency Economic Powers Act. Ruling the law never actually gave the president authority to impose broad duties without Congress. The justices did not rule on whether tariffs were good policy. They ruled on something narrower and more damaging, that the legal tool used to impose them was never built for this. An emergency powers statute written decades ago for freezing enemy assets and blocking specific transactions during declared national emergencies had been stretched to justify a blanket tax on nearly every import entering the country. The court said that stretch went too far. And once the court said that, every dollar collected under that authority became a liability the moment the ruling landed, not just going forward, but retroactively for everything already collected. The tax foundation calculated the damage in the weeks that followed. A total of $166 billion has to be returned, equal to roughly 3/4 of everything collected between the start of the tariff program and the Supreme Court ruling. By June, the government was running a $25 billion negative balance for that single month alone, because refund payments outpaced new tariff income coming in from whatever tariffs remained legally standing. Read that again. The government was paying out more in refunds than it was taking in from the tariffs still on the books. That is not a policy adjustment. That is a fund running dry in real time, while the people managing it kept announcing new versions of the same program. Here's how the refund mechanism actually works, because this is the part most coverage skips entirely. When a court strikes down a tariff, the money does not automatically fly back into the accounts of every company that paid it. Businesses have to file individually with Customs and Border Protection, submitting documentation for every shipment, every entry number, every dollar they're claiming back. For a small importer, that might mean a few filings. For a company moving thousands of containers a year, it means a filing backlog that can take months to clear, sometimes longer, especially when the volume of claims spikes all at once because a single court ruling invalidated years of collections in one afternoon. Some companies will get their money back by the end of this year. Others are being told to expect next year. A few smaller importers, the kind without a legal department to manage the paperwork, may not recover the full amount at all before deadlines or documentation gaps eat into what they're owed. And here is where it gets specific to Canada. Mark Carney's government had spent over a year absorbing tariff hikes it called unjustified. First 10%, then 50% on autos, dairy, and alcohol, layered under a legal authority that a U.S. court had already ruled unconstitutional months before the increases were even announced. Ottawa did not get an apology when the ruling came down. It did not get the money back automatically either. Canadian exporters and the American companies importing their goods are now standing in the same refund queue as everyone else, filing paperwork for tariffs a court already said should never have been collected in the first place, because immediately after losing in court, the administration pivoted rather than paused. It invoked Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a Cold War-era provision last used by Richard Nixon in 1971 that allows a 15% surcharge for a maximum of 150 days, unless Congress votes to extend it. Congress did not extend it. That authority died on schedule on July 24th, exactly as the statute required. So on July 23rd, one day before it expired, the United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer announced tariffs of 10 to 12.5% on 60 nations at once, this time under Section 301, a provision investigators can build a case for country by country, with no rate ceiling and no expiration date written into it at all. Watch the sequence because the pattern only becomes visible when you line the dates up next to each other. Court strikes it down in February. Government confirms $166 billion in refunds owed by summer. Temporary replacement expires in July, exactly as Congress designed it to when it wrote the 150-day limit into the law decades ago. And the administration launches a new version the day before, wider in scope, covering 60 countries at once, structured under a legal provision that never has to end on its own. Every time one legal door closes, a new one opens, and each successive version is built to be harder to challenge in court than the last one. For Carney, this is the second time in 18 months that Washington's own court system has validated what Ottawa had been arguing publicly since the tariffs first started climbing. The first ruling back in February was treated in Canadian media largely as vindication, proof that the pressure campaign rested on shaky legal ground. The second confirmation, the refund total itself, landed less than 6 months later and is being read differently inside the Canadian government, less like a one-time court win and more like a pattern. A senior Canadian trade official speaking on background after the refund figures became public described the situation as confirmation that the legal exposure was real from the beginning, not a temporary technicality that would resolve itself quietly. Carney's own language shifted the same week the refund number circulated. Standing in front of every provincial premier in the country, he told them Canada would do whatever it takes to defend itself against the ongoing trade escalation, a phrase no Canadian prime minister has used publicly about the United States in modern memory. Diplomatic language usually softens hard positions. This was the opposite. A prime minister choosing total commitment rhetoric in the same week. His government's legal argument received its second court validation is not a coincidence of timing. It's a leader deciding the moment has come to stop hedging. Here's the number that matters most to anyone not currently reading a customs filing for a living. Independent estimates project the tariff program, across all its versions, will lower economic growth by roughly 0.6% and cost the country around 450,000 full-time equivalent jobs over the long run. At the same time, the tariffs added roughly $1,000 to the average American household's tax burden last year alone, according to estimates built from the same trade data the administration's own numbers are being checked against. So line up what actually happened. The government spent the better part of a year collecting money from American importers. It is now refunding $166 billion of that because two separate courts ruled the collection illegal, and the households who paid the original marked up prices at checkout are not the ones getting reimbursed. The businesses that overpaid get refund checks, eventually after the paperwork clears. The consumers who absorbed the price increase at the register during the months the tariffs were being collected illegally do not get a check at all. There's no refund line item for a family that paid more for groceries or auto parts in 2025 because an importer passed along a cost that a federal court later ruled should never have existed. This is the part that should outlast the headline because it's bigger than any single country's trade dispute. $166 billion moving out of the Treasury and back into corporate accounts is not a rounding error tucked into a budget footnote. It's larger than the annual budget of most federal agencies combined. And it happened because the legal foundation for collecting it was wrong from the start, confirmed not once but twice by courts across a 5-month span. While the government kept the machine running the entire time, the challenges worked their way through appeals. Carney's government did not need to say much publicly this week because the numbers did the talking on their own. A neighboring country's Supreme Court had already ruled in Canada's favor once, back in February. The Treasury's own refund total just ruled in Canada's favor a second time, this time in dollars instead of legal language, 6 months later. And the administration's response to being told twice that the collection method was illegal was not to slow down and rebuild on firmer legal ground. It was to open a new channel immediately on 60 more countries at once, one day before the old authority technically expired on its own terms. The pattern is now 3 tariff regimes deep in 18 months, struck down, replaced, struck down again. Replaced again, this time under a provision with no expiration date at all, built into the statute. Whatever comes next, it will not carry a 150-day clock that forces a natural review point the way the last one did, which means whatever bill it generates, if courts eventually rule against this version 2, the way they ruled against the previous 2, will not be capped at 15%, and it will not resolve itself in 5 months through the natural expiration Congress wrote into the last law. It will be however large the government allows it to grow before the next ruling eventually arrives, and however long the refund queue behind it ends up stretching for the businesses and the households still waiting for the money that was never supposed to be collected in the first place. Now widen the lens, because Canada is one country inside a list of 60, and the 60 were not chosen randomly. The Office of the United States Trade Representative opened Section 301 investigations into what it described as America's largest trading partners earlier this year, and by June had announced affirmative determinations against all 60 of them in a single press release. Those 60 economies taken together account for more than 99% of everything the United States imports. There is functionally no major trading partner left outside this list. Japan is on it. The European Union is on it as a bloc. Brazil is on it. South Korea, Vietnam, India, all of them on the same list, subject to the same country-by-country rate structure, ranging from 10 to 12.5%, depending on the specific findings against each one. What that means practically is that the refund story playing out with Canada right now is not an isolated dispute between two neighboring economies. It is the leading edge of a much larger reckoning. If the legal reasoning that struck down the emergency powers tariffs and then the Section 122 surcharge eventually gets applied to the new Section 301 tariffs as well, the refund bill sitting at $166 billion today could look small by comparison. Trade lawyers who filed some of the original challenges have already signaled they view Section 301 as more legally defensible than the previous 2 attempts, specifically because it requires individual investigations and findings for each country rather than a blanket global declaration. That is very likely why the administration chose it this time. It is harder to strike down in one sweeping ruling the way the last 2 were struck down. But harder does not mean impossible, and the same courts that ruled twice already have not signaled they consider trade law settled. Look at what each version actually was, side by side, because the pattern is close to unprecedented in modern American trade policy. Version 1 relied on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a statute passed in 1977 for freezing the assets of hostile foreign governments and blocking specific transactions during declared emergencies. It had never before been used to impose a blanket tariff on nearly every country on Earth. The Supreme Court said, in essence, that this was never what the law was for. Version 2 relied on Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a provision that had been used exactly once before by Richard Nixon in 1971 during a genuine balance of payments crisis that forced the United States off the gold standard. It came with a hard statutory ceiling and a hard statutory deadline, and when that deadline arrived, it expired exactly as written, because Congress built it that way specifically so no single administration could extend an emergency measure indefinitely without lawmakers voting on it. Version 3, the one currently active, uses Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, the same law that governs the ongoing tariffs on Chinese goods that have existed in some form since the first Trump administration. It is the most legally conventional of the three approaches. It is also, by design, the one with no built-in expiration. 3 different legal foundations in under 2 years. 2 of them already collapsed in federal court. The dollar figure attached to that collapse, $166 billion and rising as more refund claims get processed, is now large enough that some of the same congressional committees that declined to extend Section 122 are beginning to ask whether Section 301 deserves the same scrutiny before it generates a bill even larger than the one taxpayers and importers and neighboring governments like Canada's are currently being asked to sort